Welcome to our weekly 3-minute therapy podcast. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, clinical psychologist. I practice rational emotive behavior therapy and author. And my main book is called 3-Minute Therapy. And I'm here with my co host, Mick Berry, who's also an expert on rational emotive behavior therapy. And rational emotive behavior therapy was the first cognitive behavior therapy, and it's based on the first principle, which is that our emotions come from our thinking about situations, not from situations themselves. So that's a very powerful idea. If you are disturbed in any way, anxious, depressed, or angry, then you have a lot of control over changing that, and that is by looking at your thinking. And normally, the kind of thinking that leads to those emotions are thinking in terms of demands: must, should, supposed to's, have to's. And there are three main demands: I must do well and get approval, or else I'm no good. You must treat me well, excuse me, or else you're no good. And my life must go well. And if it doesn't, my life is no good. And those ideas lead to uh, various emotional problems such as anxiety, guilt, depression, anger, resentment, and procrastination and addictions. So we apply rational emotive behavior therapy to various areas, and I show you how you can think about them from a psychological perspective. Mick, would you like to add anything about that?
No, that pretty much sums up REBT.
Okay, and today we'll be discussing REBT and the arts. And the arts consists of music, sculpture, painting, literature, architecture, performing arts, film. So, Mick, do you want to start with that?
Sure, we can start out. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but Goethe came up with a great criteria for judging art. What is the artist trying to do? Is he or she doing it? And is it worth doing? And making it that simple makes it a lot easier to assess whether or not art is worth anything. Now, the thing is, as somebody who's involved in the arts, I know my own experience has been one of frequent frustration because there's a certain level I attempt to get to and I often cannot get there or am not able to get there as quickly as I'd like. And it's like anything else that we have that's a desire. If we demand to get it, then we'll drive ourselves nuts. If we have the capacity to accept, well, I don't have to have this, I can still accept my life and I can still accept myself and I can still accept other people, even if I don't get this. I might not be happy. I will remain simply frustrated in not getting what I want if I'm not achieving it, but I will not make myself have anxiety, depression, or get angry about it. One of the problems in the arts is, and this is one of the virtues of it, if anybody creates art, it's something that they are very passionate about. And as we've talked about, the greater your passion for something, the greater your desire for something, the more easily you may turn the desire into a demand. So I think in the arts, it can be particularly challenging in creating something to not become demanding about it. But in becoming demanding about something, then we actually hinder our creativity because we're creating all of this anxiety and we become engrossed in our obsession over I must achieve this rather than how may I achieve this. So those are just some of my initial thoughts on it. Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, that's pretty complete. One thing I'd like to add is another problem with arts, no matter what aspect of arts it is procrastination. So you may have a goal For example, I've written 5 books. So, um, in order to write the book, it means sitting down and uh, facing discomfort or frustration in writing a draft and getting the draft right and interesting. So it's easy if you're in any aspect of the arts to procrastinate. And often one of the demands in procrastination is it must be easy, it must be perfect, it must be outstanding. And as long as you have those demands, you're more likely to procrastinate on getting started, or once you get started, keep going at it.
And I'll add to that something you taught me. Another demand people often make is I must not procrastinate. And then you escalate it and make it harder to begin. I'm reminded of when it comes to writing, I've found this to be very, very helpful. There's a science fiction writer, I don't believe he's alive now, but a man named Theodore Sturgeon, who was quite successful. And somebody was talking with him, I think it might have been a critic, who said, I don't like science fiction because 90% of it is crap. And do you know what Theodore Sturgeon's reply to that was?
What was it?
90% of everything is crap,
Right.
which I think is a great retort. And also, I've looked into this. Rudyard Kipling himself said that 90% of what I write is no good. But to get to, he might have said 80% or something, but to get to that percentage, which is much smaller than the lousy stuff I write, I have to write and do all of the writing that isn't good and then discern, okay, this is no good, I'm throwing it away, I'm going to rewrite this and make it better. Almost all writers I know are great at rewriting. Once in a while, you can get somebody like Mozart who will write stuff off the first draft and it's brilliant and there you go and the whole world envies him. But as I think I mentioned when we did this before, Beethoven rewrote his stuff like crazy. I've been told Tolstoy rewrote War and Peace 50 times, and this is a 1,000-page novel, for God's sake. So I've found it particularly helpful with Theodore Sturgeon saying 90% of everything is crap to cut through the demand that I must not write crap or I must not perform stuff that I would label as garbage. I just want to do better than that. But if I do, what's the big surprise? 90% of everything is garbage. And you can have the attitude, well, I'm going to do better than this and work and put in the time to try to make things better than to try to raise it up to a level that I'm happy with.
Another demand that some people may have is I must create my work on my own without help. And there's no law saying it has to be that way. With the 5 books I've written, I've had co-authors with all those books, which I found very helpful and motivating. So don't think that you have to do it all on your own. Mick?
And it's a great point. A lot of people don't realize this. If you take some of the greatest writers we know in our era, Truman Capote, Vladimir Nabokov, and several others, took their books to a man named William Maxwell, who was the editor of The New Yorker, for final revisions, and he would give them tips. And along those lines, boy, if you want some inspiration here, although it's a little intimidating, but Ezra Pound was a good friend of T.S. Eliot's, and T.S. Eliot was writing a poem called The Wasteland, and he took it to Ezra Pound, and Ezra Pound just axed out the first 5 pages. Then when he came to the line, April is the cruelest month, he circled that sentence. He said, that's the beginning of your poem. And this is a poem that was recognized by literary scholars as the greatest poem of the 20th century. So even the greatest poem of the 20th century was prey to the slashings of a critic before it became the greatest poem of the 20th century.
Oh, fascinating, fascinating.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on, Mick.
Well, I was just going to say, and if you look at Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare is inarguably one of the greatest writers of the English language. Whenever his plays are produced, Hamlet is almost never produced in its entirety. And Shakespeare I would definitely use the word genius to describe him. If he's not a genius, then who is? However, Not all of his plays are brilliant. The thing that's so daunting about this guy is that you could take 37 plays and probably 20 of them are masterpieces, but not all of them. And so, we have certain high standards to aim for. And in aiming for them, you can pretty much count on experiencing frustration. And I've found increasing my frustration tolerance has aided me greatly in being able to live with those latency periods of when stuff is being developed into being great. I can think of also with Lennon and McCartney, I'd go so far as to say that they were the greatest songwriting team of the 20th century, and they wrote a lot of stuff that had to be revised. In particular, the song "I Saw Her Standing There." The first lines were originally she was just 17, never been a beauty queen. And John Lennon said to Paul McCartney, "Paul, that line is crap. It's got to go." And Paul said, "What should we replace it with?" And Lennon said, "I don't know. Put in, you know what I mean. We'll fix it later." And that ended up being the line that they kept. So if the greatest songwriting team of the 20th century sometimes looked upon their work and said, "Boy, that line is crap. It's got to go," it's not any surprise if you yourself, as somebody creating art, has to face the fact that they create stuff that could be classified as drivel.
Yeah, yeah, good point. Yes. So if you have a demand there, it has to be outstanding on the first try. It has to be perfect. Then that's another road to procrastination and not doing at least something. Mick?
Yeah, and I was going to say also, when do you know that it's good enough? Well, actually, it's kind of funny. Tennessee Williams kept revising his plays his whole life. He would come up with another version of Glass Menagerie or Streetcar Named Desire. Now, there weren't drastic changes, but he would change a sentence here or there. However, once read there's a really good movie critic in the San Francisco Chronicle, Mick LaSalle, and he said, "The greatest films are not flawless. The greatest films are so great we don't notice or we forgive their flaws. The flaws just are unimportant because the entire experience of the movie is so wonderful. You really don't even think about the flaws because the movie is so overwhelmingly fantastic."
Yeah, and that brings up another point. We've been talking about producing art, but then there's enjoying art. And if you want to enjoy art, also avoid having must, and that is this work must be perfect and it must not be boring, it must not be repetitive. And if you uproot those musts, then you'll do better at enjoying art. Yeah.
And I was going to say, when I enjoy art, I like to uphold the high standards. And when I'm watching something that I consider subpar, I like to at least think, well, I could learn from this, possibly. So there is that usefulness of it. And I do seek out certain works of art that I think will be fantastic. It's interesting how Thornton Wilder talked about he began to write plays because he saw plays in the 1920s in which he found himself grading them and giving them an A. But he said something I thought was really wonderful. The experience of giving something an A is entirely different than being overwhelmed by a work of art. And so I would say that's the criteria I go by. I would like to be overwhelmed by a work of art. However, when that doesn't happen, then I just live with the less than desirable results by saying, well, what can I learn from this? And how could this have been better? And onward and upward to the next thing.
Yeah, great information and insight, Mick. Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I could go on for days about this because, as you know, I'm a musician and an actor and a writer and a stand-up comic. And it's interesting when I've been reading a book on writing stand-up comedy, and this guy came up with a very good exercise. He said, write down 40 jokes, 40 great jokes you see other comedians do. And he said, don't expect to do this in a day. This is a several months project. So I've been writing down great jokes. And he said, you want these to be jokes you consider great and not good, great. And then you have a gold standard to aim by. And I will say it is definitely up the ante for me. However, I do have to deal with the frustration of not being able to write jokes that are as great as my list. And okay, how could this be better? How could this be better? No, not funny enough, not funny enough yet. So I find in being able to deal with frustration and being able to raise my frustration tolerance, I'm able to raise the quality of what I produce and to then be happier with the results of my efforts. Now, in terms of observing art, it is one of the things that's wonderful about art is how it can be interpreted and experienced in several different ways, and not everything is everybody's cup of tea. And I fully grant people, like I teach a lot of drum students, and some of them love metal. I personally do not like metal, but I'll teach it to them if this is what they want to do and if this is what they enjoy doing. So what somebody enjoys is not necessarily what somebody else enjoys. I'm reminded of their three criteria for producing art. If you want to really make it great art, there are three E's. You want to entertain, first and foremost, you have to entertain. Then you want to educate, and then elevate. Have people, after they experience the art, to be enriched and have lives that are richer than they were before they were exposed to the art. But again, not demanding these to happen, but having a very strong passion for that to happen, whether you're creating art or observing art and enjoying art or attempting to enjoy art.
One of the things that's amazed me and impressed me about watching performers in various arts is how they remember, if it's a play, how they remember all their lines, or if it's a concert, how they remember all the notes. And I imagine that takes a lot of practice, 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 just as we recommend with REBT and uprooting your demands, your musts and shoulds. It takes a lot of practice, and it means having high frustration tolerance in dealing with the practice, because it could be frustrating and boring to practice the same thing over and over again. Mick, we don't have that much more time, so do you want to add the last word?
Yeah, first off, I want to say a few things, and I'll try to make it quick. Um, Memorizing lines is the easiest thing in doing a play. It's technical, there's nothing creative about it. And often people tell me, how do you memorize everything? It's not amazing. That's the easiest thing to do. And aside from that, I just wanted to throw that in, though I can appreciate that people are amazed by it. But it's there's nothing creative about memorizing lines. And I'll just close in saying that REBT advocates practicing not having a demand, but keeping a desire. And when we're passionate about something, it's so easy to flip that desire into a demand. Practice, 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 keeping a very white hot, strong, passionate desire while not turning it into a demand. It's very possible to become highly skilled at that. And I've found that my life is so much richer than if I simply followed the advice of some people who say, well, don't have strong desires then. That's ridiculous. Have strong desires, practice not turning them into demand, and have a very passionate, full life.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Mick. And thank you, Chris Rossini, our tech engineer. Comment below if you would like to comment on what you saw. Give us a thumbs up if you thought it was interesting, useful, or informative. Suggest subjects that you'd like us to discuss, and volunteer if you'd like to be a guest on our show, and subscribe to the 3-Minute Therapy podcast to do what, Mick?
To stay on let's say, to stay on the rational and passionate side of life. I'll throw that
Great.